For most of the Jewish world, the death of the messianic claimant Shabtai Tzvi in 1676 signified the return of order and unity. But even in the short term, this raised some uncomfortable questions. Just how was Judaism going to be healed? What would be done to prevent something like Shabtai Tzvi from happening again? What would be the vision for Judaism going forward? And perhaps most contentiously, whose vision? Well, first of all, we need to understand how the Jewish legal system worked at this time. Altogether, the court system hadn't actually changed that much since the days of the Temple. The most basic unit of a Jewish community was the synagogue, led by a rabbi and usually presided over by a rabbinic panel known as a Beit Din. In large cities, these synagogues were subordinate to a municipal rabbinate, and these in turn were subordinate to a national rabbinate, headed by what we used to call a Nagid back in the Middle Ages, but at this point we're just calling the Rav Rashi, or chief rabbi. In Poland and the Ottoman Empire, where the Jewish populations were largest and most spread out, another intermediate rabbinate was established at the provincial level, known as a Kahal. And though each Kahal was equal in theory, in reality the most influential was the chief rabbi of Ottoman Palestine, known as the Rishon LeZion. This position had coincidentally been created right at the outbreak of the Sabbatean movement, and its first office holder, a man named Moshe Galante the Younger, had refrained from rendering a final verdict on whether Tzvi was truly the Messiah. But once the movement had crashed and burned, it was Galante, above all other rabbis in the Jewish world, who advocated for readmitting former Sabbateans back into mainstream Judaism. So, in the last episode when I said, with many former Sabbateans taking leadership roles to mend ties and return to normative Jewish orthodoxy, I was really talking about Galante. However, not everyone agreed with Galante's approach, instead seeking to punish former Sabbateans so they would never feel free to revert to their former beliefs. As the Rishon LeZion, Galante was the final word on the matter in Damascus Ayalit, so he couldn't be openly flouted, at least not there. But perhaps the biggest critic of Galante's methods ended up being his own grandson, Moshe Chagiz. Chagiz's yeshiva, the Beit Yaakov, had actually been founded by his late father, who had served as chief rabbi for Jerusalem. The elder Chagiz had died when Moshe was very young, but he had been such a fanatical opponent of Sabbateanism that he blamed Kabbalah itself as the cause of the movement and forbid its teaching at the yeshiva. This was a worldview that Moshe Chagiz took to heart, envisioning crypto-Sabbateans as lurking behind every corner, viciously attacking Kabbalists as the source of all his woes. This would turn out to be something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. In 1689, Galante died, giving the yeshiva's main benefactor an excuse to cut off funding. Around the same time, Chagiz lost both his wife and their child to complications from childbirth, leading his father-in-law, a former Sabbatean no less, to cut off his funding. This, combined with a new tax structure imposed by the Ottomans, drove the Beit Yaakov into bankruptcy. Chagiz tried to make up for the loss of income by collecting the payout from a lawsuit filed by his mother years earlier. But that meant going to Safed, the capital of Kabbalah, where he just ended up making enemies. Now fully broke, Chagiz decided to leave Palestine and make his living as an author and polemicist in Europe. However, this proved unprofitable. Chagiz's reputation as a troublemaker in Jerusalem preceded him, leading rabbis in Italy to largely ignore his offers. In growing frustration, he became convinced that these rabbis must have been crypto-Sabbateans, conspiring to bring down Judaism from within. After publishing what remained of his grandfather's unreleased writings in Venice, Chagiz decided to take the fight against this supposed Sabbatean conspiracy to the heart of the Sephardic West, Amsterdam, the city that had condemned the infamous Spinoza. Surely there he could fashion himself a Jewish inquisitor general, hunting down hidden Sabbateans, Kabbalists, and other nonconformist heretics wherever he may find them. Identify, isolate, expel. He was in for some disappointment. The Sephardic West had come a long way since the days of Spinoza's expulsion. In the wake of Shabtai Tzvi's rise and fall, more and more Western Jews had come to admire Spinoza, gravitating towards an increasingly secular lifestyle, but without openly challenging the halachic teachings of the rabbis, who in turn shied away from their former reactionary stances in the name of preserving Jewish unity. This had the interesting effect that the next generation of rabbis and lay administrators had grown up in a much more secular, pluralistic environment. In a generation, the Ma'amads of Amsterdam and London had become bastions of liberalism, to the point that the Ma'amad had no interest in censoring nonconformist Hebrew literature, or even appointing a former Sabbatean, Solomon Aylion, as chief rabbi. But that was only the Sephardic West. During the Deluge, several thousand Ashkenazi Jews fleeing war-torn Poland had resettled in Amsterdam, where they maintained their own separate synagogue and rabbinic authority. And while the ensuing decades had enabled some Sephardic-style liberalization to cross over, conservative hardliners still largely held sway over the congregation. At this time, the leader of Amsterdam's Ashkenazim was one such hardliner, the Hacham Tzvi Ashkenazi, who had made a name for himself as an enemy of not just Kabbalah, but also secularism. Around the time of Hagiz's arrival in Amsterdam, Ashkenazi had traveled to London to challenge its chief rabbi, David Nieto, over allegations that he had given a sermon in support of the late Spinoza. Ironically, due to the unique circumstances, Ashkenazi actually ruled in Nieto's favor, as a result of which many of London's Jews rallied around him and offered him many rewards, which he naturally refused out of a classically biblical aversion to pride. If Moshe Hagiz was ever going to have a friend in his life, it was going to be this guy. And in 1713, an opportunity arrived to test whether they could truly lead the charge and stamp out Jewish unorthodoxy. On the 30th of June, a notorious and outspoken Sabbatean arrived in Amsterdam by the name of Nehemiah Chia Chayun. Once a rabbi in his hometown of Skopje, Chayun had not only continued promoting the belief in Shabtai Tzvi as the Jewish Messiah, but had continued the Sabbatean practice of redemption through ritual violation, a doctrine which had come to be known as antinomianism. Chayun's initial writings claimed, through interpretation of the Zohar, that Shabtai Tzvi had been reincarnated and would reveal himself to the world again in 1706. These writings had already earned him cherems in Skopje and Jerusalem, but Aylion and the Ma'amad showed no indication of coming down on Chayun. Well, that just wouldn't stand. As soon as Chayun arrived in the city, Hagiz and Ashkenazi requested that Aylion issue a gag order. Instead, Aylion put together a committee to investigate Chayun's new manuscript. Ashkenazi was offered a place on the investigating committee, but he declined. He didn't trust Aylion and his liberal allies to render a just decision, and instead chose to issue his own cherem against Chayun, supported by Hagiz on the 23rd of July. Now, this relative gentleness toward Chayun was not out of any great love of Sabbateanism on the part of Amsterdam's Jews. Nehemiah Chayun was an artifact of a bygone era. After all, 1706 had come and gone. The only reason he'd come to Amsterdam was to publish updated versions of his predictions that moved the date of the Messianic Age to 1714. Rather, this was seen as a freedom of speech issue, and under that framework, it was Ashkenazi and Hagiz who came off as the real threat, receiving the label of Baalei Machlokot, masters of divisiveness. Over the next 2 weeks, Ashkenazi and Hagiz were frequently ambushed in the streets. Even Ashkenazi's conservative congregants turned against him, removing him from the leadership of their synagogue. In the midst of this, on the 7th of August, Aylion and the committee issued their findings, that Chayun's work was not to be suppressed, and that Ashkenazi and Hagiz had cruelly and recklessly persecuted him. On the 9th of November, Aylion issued a cherem against the two rabbis, who spent the following 2 months under protective custody before quietly fleeing the city in January. So too left Chayun, who was quickly forgotten about, and Jewish life in Amsterdam quietly moved on. Homeless and discredited, Rabbi Ashkenazi sent his wife and children away to the town of Emden. He would never live with them again. Instead, he sought solace among his allies in London, who were so happy to receive him that they even proposed to mint a commemorative coin in his honor. Ashkenazi, old school as he was, refused such a graven image. But perhaps misunderstanding his opposition, they instead conspired to surprise him with this. At this point, it was clear. Tzvi Ashkenazi could not remain in the West. His world was over. He died just 3 years later, having fled to Poland. But Hagiz's work was just beginning. Now living in Altona, a suburb of Hamburg, Hagiz engaged in committees of correspondence all over Europe and the Mediterranean, seeking to discredit Kabbalists of all stripes and extinguish any possibility of a Sabbatean resurgence. As ever, this obsessive witch hunt received little attention and even less support. That is, until 1729, when news reached Hagiz of an extraordinary young man in the Venetian Republic who seemed to represent everything Hagiz hated. This time, Hagiz's efforts would reunite the Jewish world, but not in the way he had hoped. Born in 1707, Mosè Luzzatto was a child of the Jewish ghetto of Padua, home to one of the few universities in Europe where Jews were allowed to study. Luzzatto probably attended the university, as he was known to be popular with a group of other Jewish students who dabbled in both Kabbalah and scientific experimentation. But Luzzatto's first love was the written word, composing hundreds of poems, from personal elegies to love poems to imitations of the biblical Psalms. He even began writing plays and novels in Hebrew, and not biblical or Mishnaic or even medieval Hebrew, but the modern Hebrew that had emerged in Palestine after the expulsion from Spain and had evolved alongside the vernacular Arabic, leading later thinkers to credit him as the father of modern Hebrew literature. In addition to poetry and plays, he wrote guides to modern Hebrew writing style, logic, and public speaking. And by the way, he did all of this by the age of 20. Pretty soon, he was basically a professor of the Zohar, and was so respected that he and his students were exempted from local laws requiring Jewish men to attend Shabbat services so they wouldn't spend their weekends gambling. So respected, in fact, that even outside of Padua, people had already begun to refer to him by his rabbinic acronym, the Ramchal. It was at this very time in his life when Luzzatto had a dream in which an angelic messenger known as a Maggid came to him with a litany of Kabbalistic lessons. Luzzatto never intended to publicize this experience, but word got out when his top student, Yekutiel Gordon, considered dropping out of the university to study Kabbalah full-time. Luzzatto told him that the Maggid had wanted Gordon to excel in both religion and his chosen field of medicine, a revelation which Gordon relayed in a letter to his family in Lithuania that somehow found its way into the hands of one Moshe Hagiz. Now, dreams of this kind were not unheard of. Yosef Karo, the ever-practical author of the Shulchan Aruch, claimed to have had such visions and credited them as part of his writing process. Even Hagiz himself claimed to have had such an experience, and if we step away from the religious perspective, it's understandable that this sort of thing would happen to people who spend their entire waking lives studying theology. The problem wasn't the vision. It was Luzzatto. First of all, he was very young. Younger than most yeshiva graduates, let alone ordained rabbis, and younger than anyone who had ever publicly claimed to be visited by a Maggid. From a certain point of view, it would have come off as almost unearned. Furthermore, Luzzatto walked a line between Jewish and Gentile society which, although not that strange in the Jewish world at large, was unusual for an Ashkenazi rabbi, especially in a country like Venice where Jews were confined to ghettos. In addition to completely shaving his face and profaning the language of the Bible with romantic comedy, he had no wife or even fiancé, which for a rabbi was basically unheard of, and instead elected to spend all his nights surrounded by other young men. Now at last, Hagiz had found an enemy whose sinful pretensions would rally the skeptics and detractors around him. In a series of letters to the chief rabbinate of Venice, to other rabbis in the region, and even to Luzzatto himself, Hagiz condemned Luzzatto's combination of low living and religious arrogance, calling him a wretched renegade who had betrayed his religion and lost his portion in the world to come. The lad and all the members of his society should be condemned as inciters and corrupters. This onslaught infuriated Luzzatto. How could it be that a rabbi this loathsome, whose notoriety was well known even before Luzzatto himself was born, could be gaining traction? What evil would befall Hagiz if God responded to his requests? For must one always walk in darkness and not in light? Would God neglect us forever and not peek at us through the slits, even in the land of our imprisonment? But with this fury came a new sense of validation. Luzzatto began to realize that he and his society represented the start of something much bigger. For the honor of your Torah knows that all the esteemed rabbis of the Holy Roman Empire and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, may the Lord keep them for the length of days, have power. But I too have the power of the Blessed Holy One and his presence, and all the members of the yeshiva on high who illuminate my eyes with the light of the Lord, and there should be no obstacle, perish the thought to see whose words prove true. Hagiz in turn intensified his campaign by lobbying the rabbinate of Padua to investigate Luzzatto for the purpose of issuing a cherem. In this orphaned generation, the Jewish people does not need anything new. The innovations that come every year against the truth accepted by us and confirmed by the sages. For in my opinion on this matter, all the Jewish communities, their rabbis, and their leaders will agree that innovation is only a bad thing, and nothing good can come of it. Luzzatto must surrender all his books and writings to the rabbis of the General Yeshiva, and he must commit himself, under pain of excommunication and a serious oath, not to utter or publish from his writings anything in the name of a Maggid or a dreamer of dreams. Caught in the midst of this escalating battle was Luzzatto's childhood rabbi, Isaiah Bassan. Bassan was no friend of the rabbis who spinelessly entertained Hagiz's madness for power, but he had grown frustrated with Luzzatto's hot head. Regarding the essence of the matter, there is not the slightest doubt in my heart that your words are honorable, for you have been God-fearing since your childhood. But I cannot refrain from stating that the matter is far beyond me, for your illumination has reached a degree higher than that of Rabbi Luria. How did you carelessly reveal yourself to that Rabbi Yakutiel? Don't you know that it is the foolish way of Ashkenazi Jews to publicize and confuse everything? In my opinion, this is one of the causes of our prolonged exile. As it stood, the chief rabbis of Venice offered a compromise that they believed would keep Luzzatto in good standing with the Jewish community while technically addressing Hagiz's complaints in such a way that he would look like an unreasonable buffoon for continuing his protests, which of course he did. At Bassan's urging, Luzzatto signed the agreement. The conditions were thus: Luzzatto would not be allowed to teach Kabbalah again until his 40th birthday, and then only in Palestine. He would also have to get a beard. Well, 2 beards. But most frustrating to Luzzatto were the provisions that the majority of his writings on Kabbalah be handed over, most of which were burned, and that any of his future work would be subject to review by the Venetian rabbinate before publication. Ultimately, Luzzatto's core following of spiritually inclined young men not only survived the end of his teaching career but thrived. But, as it turned out, the amount of Luzzatto's work which the rabbis judged fit for publication was none of it. From this, Luzzatto concluded that staying in Padua was no longer an option. In 1735, he moved with his family to Amsterdam, where he spent the daylight hours as a diamond cutter in order to finance what would turn out to be his magnum opus. Although Luzzatto published dozens of texts during his time in Amsterdam, none proved as popular as Mesilat Yesharim, The Path of the Upright. A departure from his usual philosophical work, Mesilat Yesharim instead addresses the question of ethics, how not to merely observe the letter of Jewish law, but the spirit, a much greater challenge around which Luzzatto constructed a Jewish analog to what we now call mindfulness. Luzzatto basically argued that those who only followed the letter were not living truthfully, and would inevitably be led to sin. But at the same time, he made the same argument against excessive piety, behaving unethically in service of religious observance. To Luzzatto, the intention was what mattered most. To truly follow the spirit of the law, he argued that one must always consider whether their habits and decisions will aid or hinder their quest for spiritual well-being, and to alter their behavior accordingly. Compared to every other major Jewish religious text I've talked about on this channel, Mesilat Yesharim is really short and surprisingly open-ended. But maybe that's exactly what the corpus of Jewish thought needed, because by the end of the 18th century, it was a required text in every yeshiva in the world. Though I'm told that teachers tend not to linger on the chapter urging moderation in piety. In preparation for the end of his ban on teaching, Luzzatto and his family relocated to Acre. He would have been allowed to resume teaching in 1747. But in 1746, Luzzatto died of either smallpox or cholera. His wife and children perished with him. Ultimately, Judaism in the 18th century, much like Judaism in the 17th century, would be defined by division rather than unity. But even so, all major Jewish movements of that century would agree on one thing. All of them would look back and proudly count the Ramchal as one of their own. Moshe Chagiz never worked again after his Pyrrhic victory against Luzzatto. He retired in Safed, surrounded by the people he had spent his life trying to destroy, and fell into such obscurity that nobody is even sure when he died. We only know that it was sometime after 1750, long enough to see everything he had spent his life fighting for fade away. The pursuit of heresy had ended. The pursuit of enlightenment could now begin. Special thanks to my patrons, including Eric Atreides, Jeremy Biskind, Osha Gordon, James Majors, Corey Ard, Matthew Brotman, Gary Davidson, Greg Maev, Branch Ortiz, JP Strathausen, Navet Tal, Brian Tooten, Useful Charts, and Earl Weiss.